Welcome in, and thanks so much for joining me. So I've been asked to give some deeper dives in some episodes here on my podcast and my YouTube channel, some deeper dives into core Buddhist principles. Usually I'm talking about those and connecting them to more practical aspects of meditation and Buddhism. But here I'd like to take a shot at a deeper dive into probably one of the core principles in Buddhism, something we both reflect on a lot, we meditate on a lot, and there's a lot of teachings from the Buddha on, which is impermanence. So impermanence often gets a bad rap because sometimes we connect impermanence with death, which we will talk a little bit about today. And just in general, sometimes people, I guess, meet impermanence on the Buddhist path in some kind of more like dire or kind of bummer way. So I hope I can, make a case here today that impermanence is not only vital, both in, reflecting on the things we don't want to reflect on or have trouble with, like, the inevitable end of our life and others' lives in this body, but also things we wouldn't normally think of. Impermanence that actually, I guess, helps us. That, if things weren't impermanent in some situations, it would be extremely bad, right? So we'll get into all that. But first, I wanted to start with a quote from the Buddha. There's many quotes from the Buddha on impermanence. This one I'm going to read is from the Dhammapada. And actually, you can find a bunch in there in the Dhammapada, really wonderful quotes on impermanence. And this quote goes like this, quote, "All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering." So why I love this quote so much is it really encapsulates the Buddhist path, right? And we do need to talk about this word suffering, and in order to talk about impermanence properly. So I'd like to talk about that in a moment. But also here, it's referring to impermanence and wisdom, that there is an underlying wisdom when we reflect on, when we meditate on impermanence, or when we're just learning about it, that grows a type of insight that benefits us, that helps us to connect more with the principle of freedom and what that means on the Buddhist path. And we can take that however we want, if that means to us just, having more well-being in our life, having a bit more ease, a bit more openness, all the way up to the idea of enlightenment and Buddhahood. And sometimes Buddhahood gets framed in this transcendent thing, when actually Buddhahood is available to all of us if we put in the time for uncovering our awakened nature. And, this whole idea of, what are we transcending and are we going somewhere? I mean, that's for another episode. But I'm of the notion, I don't know if we actually go anywhere. I don't know if we're actually here, right? So if we're not here, where are we going? Anyways, a little too much of the weeds. So coming back to this quote on impermanence, and as I said, talking a little bit about this word suffering, I personally prefer to use the word dukkha, which is a Pali and Sanskrit word that sometimes gets translated as suffering, sometimes gets translated as dissatisfaction, pain. I've even seen some translations of it as the words through the word stress. But basically, dukkha is a very deep term and point of view and philosophy in Buddhism, that essentially from the top down in our life, when we are looking outwards for our happiness, when we are looking outside of ourselves, when we're splitting our perception into this objectified mentality all the time, or what we sometimes call subject-object duality in Mahayana Buddhism, we are going to be in some form of pain because it's not aligned with what reality actually is. And, this is a topic more on the teachings on emptiness or non-duality in Buddhism, but they really do relate to impermanence here. And the reason is we do need to take some kind of a deep dive into our dukkha at some point, having, both meditations to do that, as well as learning more what it means, in order to be able to connect with impermanence. Because why would we want to meditate on impermanence in the first place? Why would we want to reflect on it? The reason, and the Buddha is pointing it out here, is to understand the nature of our dukkha, to understand, why dukkha affects us, what is it, and most importantly, how do we end it, right? So sometimes that's not talked about in Buddhist teachings, and we can get a little bit allergic to this idea of why would I want to do any kind of spiritual practice to look more at my suffering? I want to get away from my suffering. But what the Buddha pointed out is if we don't actually do the work to look at the depths of, what our dukkha is and why it's arising, because from a Buddhist perspective, it's arising fundamentally from a pretty subtle, place of confusion. So if we don't do that work through meditation, learning, and reflection on the Dharma, it's going to be really difficult to find a lasting freedom from it, right? And I'll just give you a simple example. If we look at our lives, myself included, most of us, we just jump from experience to experience, right? And if I, at the end of a day, if I look back on my day, if I'm brave enough that day to do this, I can see most of my actions were taken out of some form of averting something that was uncomfortable or moving towards something that is comfortable and or what I'm clinging to. And so we see these fundamental principles of clinging and aversion arising in our reactions to life. And these keep us on a sort of wheel. They keep us in the dark, in the sense that, it's really easy to remain in unawareness when we're constantly following our clinging and aversion. So fundamentally, Buddhist meditation, in my view, is for getting a deeper look into clinging and aversion and how it's arising and how it's binding us, right? And this word suffering, or dukkha, it's also dukkha, right? So when we use this word, it doesn't just mean the bad things that happen to us, or getting sick, or death, and or shitty emotions we don't want to feel. It's much deeper than that, right? So impermanence is actually a doorway into looking at dukkha. So we can kind of take it either way. We can either try to understand and reflect on dukkha a little bit more in order to access impermanence, or we can use impermanence in order to access dukkha a little bit. So this is related to what are called the three marks, or sometimes the 3 or 4 seals in Buddhism. And usually in order, impermanence comes first, dukkha comes second, and Buddhist non-duality or emptiness comes third. We also add on a fourth one, which is nirvana, or this so-called transcendence, beyond suffering, right? But anyways, I think there's a reason impermanence is first, is because it's the doorway. It's something quite obvious to us, even if we just take a quick look, right? And so now we're getting to the topic. So specifically, so what is impermanence? Really, impermanence, as the Buddha says here, is it's related to all conditioned things. That if something is conditioned, meaning it's related to something else, it's not on its own. It's conditioned by other factors, other phenomena, other people, other things that are arising around it, right? And really, you could take anything: food, our last meal, our bodies, our state of mind. It really relates to everything. So all conditioned things are in the nature of change. So if we just simply take this word impermanence and switch it out for the word change, I feel it becomes much more experiential, right? I mean, we could use the word impermanence. It's fine. It's not a problem. It's representing something. But really, how does this show up in our life? And for me, this shows up in the form of change, that everything is constantly changing. Or if we want to get a little more philosophic, all conditioned things are changing. Why? Because they're conditioned, right? Because they're not a singular event happening on its own. And so this is something we learn to tune into both in reflection and meditation. In meditation, we take it a little bit deeper into actually trying to see it directly. But in learning and reflection, we're just getting used to this idea. We're bringing it in. So I would recommend, if this is a new idea to you, you're just thinking if that's true or not. for me, the Buddhist path doesn't need to be dogmatic at all. It's just simply questions and prompts and deep ideas and practices for investigating our life. So just right now, just as I'm talking, just think about it for a second. Is that true? Is there anything you know of that doesn't change? Maybe that's the first question we can investigate. And if we investigate that enough, we'll see, everything changes, even things that seem, I don't know, like solid forever, like a big, huge, giant mountain. We can see that not only is the mountain changing and has changed, it is changing. Just as we've started this conversation here, that started, as you're listening, as I'm talking, that big mountain, we like to go to and visit on hikes, or maybe we live near, or maybe we visited one time. I don't know, whatever mountain you can think of. It's changed just in the time we've connected here. So if a mountain can change, of course, all kinds of other things are changing, much more rapidly. And the question is, are we noticing that? Are we paying attention? And the Buddha is pointing out here, why do we need to pay attention? Because it's one of the keys for unlocking our suffering, for unlocking, why we experience dissatisfaction, why we experience stress, anxiety, etc. And so through impermanence, we not only can start to see how reality actually is around us, we can start to see it a little bit more clearly. But of course, more importantly, we can also start to flow a little bit more with what life is, right? So if everything is changing all the time, why the hell do we hang on so tightly, right? That's not a judgment. I ask myself that question every single day because, of course, there's many things I hang on to very tightly, get upset about, get rigid around, right? And so impermanence on a, I guess I could say like a more superficial way, it's a way to unlock that, just more fluidity, more flow, freeing ourselves up to care more about the things that actually need our care and would benefit from our care, rather than the things that actually we're putting too much care into that don't matter so much, right? So this really happens when we start to bring the idea of everything's in the nature of change. We bring it into meditation to see it directly. So I don't know about you, but for me, sure, like impactful ideas and philosophies, those have had a huge effect on my life. But actually bringing them into deeper reflection and meditation has had a much larger impact, because that's where we transform. That's where we see it directly. Like it'd be the difference between hearing about something and actually seeing it with our own eyes. It has a much bigger impact, right? And of course, this takes time on the path. And, one real quick tip, how we meditate on impermanence can be quite simple, where we just simply turn the awareness to watching the nature, or watching a certain thing in our life. Could be the nature of our bodies, like just turning our awareness in meditation or mindfulness to look or be watchful of the change in our physical bodies, the change in our emotions and sensations, and of course the change in our thinking minds and how thoughts are constantly arising and falling. So as a meditator, we often do that. But if that's a little bit too advanced for you, you could also just go out into nature and practice impermanence, just with your eyes, just looking at things, looking at, the wind, water, a stream in front of you, birds and animals moving in the forest or around you, wherever you are in nature. And you'll just see everything's moving, everything's changing all the time. But as I said, that as a personal experience has has a much wider impact, right? So in regards to just impermanence in general, I recommend starting to approach it like that. And then, of course, we have the things that we don't want to acknowledge the impermanence of because we're scared, because we might have a lot of fear around that, or there's just a lot of unknowns. So it brings up anxiety. And that's understandable. I have a similar reaction. And so often in Buddhism, impermanence meditation gets connected also to dying and the death process. There's a lot to unpack here, especially in modern Western culture, where we tend to avoid death. We have lost a lot of rituals and ways of incorporating death into life. And instead, we try to preserve youth as long as we can and try to avoid talking or thinking about death. Even this idea of discussing death or bringing it up as morbid is it's a modern idea. That's not how every culture functions. That's not how even Western culture functioned, I don't know how long ago, but let's just say, 100 years ago or more. So we're in a little bit of a predicament here because we have to work with our reactions when we start to, if we're interested in bringing in death meditation or impermanence in relation to death, and we have to work with our reactions. We have to slowly work with our anxieties and fears around it. And personally, I found a lot of benefit in that. I had a death of a parent pretty early on. And so I think because of the shock of that, there was just it was just unavoidable to ignore death in my life. And so when I found practices on acknowledging impermanence, meditating on impermanence, and of course meditating on death as a form of impermanence, I welcomed them. That doesn't necessarily mean it's always easy for me. And actually, when it comes to working with my inevitable death at some point, that's hard. That's really hard. There can be, sometimes I'm working with it superficially, and there can be this sense of like, oh yeah, I accept that, blah, blah, blah. But when it really hits home, when I got to go to the doctor for a test or something, and, I'm not sure if it's something serious or not, that's when it really hits the fan. And that's when our meditation on our mortality matters a lot. Again, not because we're trying to be morbid or, I don't know how to say it, like pessimistic or something like that. Actually, it's the opposite. It's so we can live life more. So for me, I've been incorporating a meditation on death and impermanence for probably 20 years or more, and it's gradual, but it really does help me to live a bit more because it frames my life in a different way. Where, what does life mean to me if I know I only have a certain amount of time here, right? And again, some people might say, oh, well, it means, you kind of enjoy as much as you can and you live life to the fullest. I don't know. Sorry. Like, that's fine if you believe that. That's not really the Buddhist view at all, because that's a form of hedonism. And that's a form of what I said earlier, where we're just simply following our clinging, which doesn't really, for me at least, doesn't provide that much lasting happiness. In the short term, of course, it does, getting what I want and enjoying it, but it's not lasting. So Buddhism goes a little deeper. What the Buddha is really trying to get at, not as some religious idea to get you to believe. Really, he's interested in us suffering less. That's really what it comes down to. You don't have to accept that, but that's how I receive the Buddhist teachings and practices, etc. But anyways, so then when we look at it that way, and also, of course, and this is a bigger issue, and I know this goes into the kind of the belief category of, is death even an ending, right? And so in Buddhism, we actually look at death more as a transition, not an ending. And I think this changes it a lot because it means sort of, I guess, if someone gets a financial education at age 18 or 20, which is rare these days, but let's say they do, and they save up, they invest in the right stocks, blah, 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 and they're actually able to retire in their 40s, this is due to their preparation. This is due to their diligence in preparing for that transition from, working a lot of hours per week to working less or retiring early at a young age, right? So it's kind of similar. I don't know if it's exactly the same, but it's kind of similar here where from a Buddhist perspective, our mind is something non-physical that transitions after death into another form, and we can continue to practice the path and continue to grow our compassion and wisdom to help others. And so there's an element here of preparing for that transition in the Buddhist tradition, right? Which again, I'm not saying you have to believe. I don't know your background or what you're into. If you are a Buddhist practitioner, maybe this is really helpful as well. If you're not, maybe it's some food for thought. But here's, I think, where there's a really key point of why we would want to evolve or allow our impermanence meditation to also become a meditation on, that inevitably we're going to have to leave this body. And so it like I said, in my case, it's not that then that prompts me to just, YOLO into, I don't know if that's even a term anymore. You only live once into, some kind of hedonistic activity. It prompts me in order to use my time wisely, right? Because there's only a certain amount I have in this body. And I truly don't know what's going to happen when I have to leave this body. So for me, there's an incredibly positive outcome to looking at death and impermanence, right? Also, of course, these practices are connected to the wider Buddhist path of developing loving kindness, compassion, and the wisdom of non-duality in Buddhism. So it's directly connected to that. So I think I'm going to leave it there, just with some ideas on both how to reflect on impermanence, the why it's important. That's mainly what I wanted to get across here. And just some food for thought on this topic. If you want to hear more, I'm happy to do a part 2. Just let me know if this is interesting to you, to do this kind of content and to make episodes on this. And of course, you're always welcome to reach out with questions, comments. And if you just want some more support, I'm happy to point you in the right direction and or support you if I can. Thanks so much.